Recordings of the previous 2 webinars on stakeholder engagement and demographics can be found on KidsNet as well as all. I just wanted to also let you all know that we'll be hosting a webinar on October 4th, 2 o'clock Eastern, which will focus on data that are available for children and immigrant families, and that we're also in the process of developing a policy webinar, so please stay tuned for more information on that. With us today, we have Julie Sweetland.
The conference has been unmuted.
On children and immigrant families, and then Tara will describe how Colorado Children Campaign communicate about children of color and immigrant families in their state. So with that, I'd like to welcome both and pass on to Julie.
Thank you. Just making sure that I unmuted myself before I started talking. Thanks, everyone. It's always great to be with the Kids Count Network. I've got a few thoughts today based on research and analysis that we've done, courtesy of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, on thinking about how to talk about children and immigrant families in this moment and also in the context of race. Will be, I was having a little trouble clicking through, and thinking about, one thing is to think about using an overall narrative structure and thinking about what it is we need to include as we lean into this moment and raise the issue of children and immigrant families and the particular data around these children and other children of color. And so thinking about this quote here, I think is a nice quick version of how to think through what needs to be included. Policy narratives define a problem, explain how it comes about, and show what needs to be done to improve the situation. In other words, they contain explicit and implicit ideas about what is wrong and how to put it right. So I hope that the ideas that I'll share today help you think about how to define this issue and show how we can improve the situation, why there are disparities in these communities, what we can do to improve the situation, and make our implicit ideas about what's wrong and how to put it right explicit for the public. Before I launch into some of those recommendations, I would love to know, Tara as well, we'd like to hear just a little bit more about where you are on a continuum of talking about children and immigrant families. Some time ago, it was maybe 5 states that had significant immigrant populations. That's really changing now, and so new destination states are newly aware of and grappling with how to welcome and include newcomers. So I'm just curious to hear where you all are. So, Polani, could we pull up the poll? Okay, you can launch in and fill it out as soon as you are ready. What's your experience level when it comes to talking about children and immigrant families? Are you a black belt? You've been doing this for a while to good results. More of a green belt? You have some experience. You're growing and refining your techniques, but you're definitely not right away. And or a white belt. You're just getting started and perhaps are worried that you might get your framing rear end thrown to the mat. That last part is not an essential part of the question, but we'll just give a few moments for a couple more people to fill in.
All right, we've had 36 respondents, and about 3% say they feel pretty experienced, 41.7% are in the middle ground, and about 55% are in the white belt category.
Okay, very helpful. I think I made a graph come up. All right. Wonderful. So hopefully we will have this will be at the right level of challenge. So as you know, the upcoming Race for Results report will foreground and really have a central focus on children and immigrant families, both in the prose around it, but and in the data that's pulled out. And connecting, this is a new move for the Race for Results report, and connecting the issues of immigration with race, equity, diversity, and inclusion for established communities of color, connecting those two issues involves both challenges and opportunities. Some of the challenges are that spontaneously, just as a default, most Americans don't see connections between these topics. In the public mind, the topic of race is about African Americans and Latinos, and the issue of immigration is about, again, in the public mind, this is not accurate, but this is the dominant mindset people we interviewed. Immigration is seen as an issue of being about low-skilled Mexicans and high-skilled Asians. And people don't think about that so much as race, but rather where they're from, coming from other countries. So they are kind of like Mars and Venus, right, in the public mind. So to start to connect these topics in the same breath, in the same report, and to help the public, to really frame them together, brings with it one other challenge, which is that the dominant narrative, although the dominant narrative frames both of these groups, understands both of these groups, meaning racial minorities and immigrants, as likely to violate our principle of self-makingness, the bootstraps or triumphant individual ideal, where individuals, through their own effort, triumph and succeed and pursue their own fates. Americans tend to model communities of color as failing in self-makingness, and that they are seen as not working hard enough and making the right choices to secure success. And in terms of immigrants, what we found is Americans tend to model immigrants as illegal immigrants, and that they have a failure of self-makingness, and that they are not succeeding through their own effort, but are succeeding through kind of cheating the system, right? So breaking the rules, jumping the line, taking advantage of America. And so that is both of these groups have framing challenges, kind of very toxic and dominant and deep-seated attitudes among the dominant groups, appealing to these groups. So those are the two challenges. What is the opportunity in all of that? What we see at Frameworks as the opportunity is that because the same kind of gators in the swamp are eating both of the messages on both of these issues, there's a real opportunity to unseat some of those unproductive assumptions and lift both issues at the same time. There's another way of thinking about that is by finding a way to really talk about inclusion and how we welcome and need everyone that can come to our country or be in our country and contribute, by making a structural argument about why some succeed and others fail, and how structures play a role in the success and failure of us all. Really being able to take the opportunity to unseat deeply xenophobic and racist ideas, and to teach the idea of what makes opportunity less available to others. That's the opportunity in connecting these issues. So we've got our work cut out for us, so I think we've got 3 strategies that will help make this topic easier to discuss. The first is having a little clicky problem here. Okay, there we go. First recommendation is to, even though we know we're walking into a conversation that's likely to have naysayers, detractors, and a lot of misunderstanding, or even just a lot of apathy, we should not start with if it's an argument or as if we need to kind of shock people into caring or engaging. Our recommendation is to lead with an aspirational appeal to shared values rather than a stark negative evaluation of the status quo. When advocates tell the story of when they start off with "it was a dark and stormy night," the public has heard that on lots of issues. They may look up in their own sky and see if it looks dark and stormy for them, and if it doesn't, continue on with their lives. But more importantly, by constantly telling this is a crisis, this is the problem, we're failing kind of narrative, we distract or sip from detract from the public's ability to see how we can come together and create better systems. So we're going to ditch "it was a dark and stormy night" and instead use values as a frame element to establish why an issue matters to society, whether that's your state or nationally or a local community. And by values, I'm referring to the broad category of cherished cultural ideals, enduring beliefs that orient people's attitudes. In frameworks, the social science of frameworks looks at there are shared and stable sets of values. People may rank those values differently. They may act on those values differently, but we as a culture have fairly shared ideas about what counts as good and ideal in the world. So values aren't the entire frame, but they're a piece of the frame. And we use these values as a piece of messaging to establish a collective orientation, to move people from how does this affect me to how does this affect us, and to really tap into emotions that work for policy thinking. So instead of tapping into emotions like fear or worry or anger, rather tapping into emotions that get people into more of a problem-solving mode, curiosity, concern, and can-do. From the research that we did on race and immigration for a variety of projects, we are recommending these three values to work into your messaging around Race for Results 2017. Two of these should be quite familiar to you. They've been in the Kids Count repertoire for some time. And the third is a special case go-to value for some particular cases. So I'll talk through these quickly and then show a couple examples. So the first is shared prosperity, the idea that children are the basis of our future civic and economic well-being. You could use just that sentence, or you could tease that idea out by really talking about how today's children, when they have the skills they need, they're equipped to really power our economy in the future. When we ensure that children have what they need now, they'll be productive and responsible and contributing and active members of our community. They're our future decision makers and leaders, but the idea is to really paint them as part of the future, and that our future tomorrow is tied to how children are supported today. The idea of human potential is very close to this. It's the idea that children have innate talents and skills and gifts. They have potential that we need to have available for our communities in the future. And which one of those seems to be best for your message is just kind of which one, just choose the one that seems to fit with what you're talking about. If you've got some economic data, you might lean towards shared prosperity. If you're talking more about education data and early learning, you might lean more towards human potential and the idea of kind of really fostering what's within them. But both of those are close cousins and are a good initial opening statement for why we should care about, really other people's children, right? Why are children a public issue, not merely a private family matter? The third value that we're recommending this time is human dignity. It's a moral argument. It's the idea that we have a moral obligation or moral duty to respect people as people, that everyone, regardless of their background, where they are born or their race, have a right to certain levels of dignity and respect. And so that is a value that you can reach for, particularly in talking about, we found this to be particularly effective on issues in immigration that are related to kind of violations of human rights. So family separation, detention centers, denial of language rights, those sorts of things. And we can see a role for this in really talking about some of the egregious affronts to human rights that we're seeing happen in other communities of color, whether that is hate crimes, unwarranted use of force by police, family separation in those cases, and in the case of just different types of family separation, whether it's through incarceration or foster system, et cetera. So that human dignity argument can be very useful for established communities of color on those same sorts of issues. So that's 3 values, and if the distinctions between those weren't clear, I encourage you to enter some questions into the Q&A box, and I'll pause in just a moment, and we'll make sure this is all tracking and can clarify anything that I went through too quickly or didn't quite make sense. But let's look at some examples of how you might apply these values to some typical Race for Results prose. Here's an example of a pretty standard, I think, kids count starting. The outlook is bleak for the children in our state and our nation. Too few have access to what they need to grow, develop, and thrive, and the lack of opportunity is structured by race. So this is that dark and stormy night story that I was cautioning against. I would encourage you all to keep shining a light on the disparities and to be unafraid to talk about race, but beginning your communication like this, right at the instant you are making a strong partisan sort of appeal. It's an opinion rather than a fact. It's not tapping into a value per se. It's just kind of saying, hey, this is a problem. And so that crisis messaging we've seen backfire more often than not. And we've got good data to show that when you appeal to a value like this on the right side, on the green side of the screen, you really orient people into the issue in a more productive, positive way that has measurable results and their likelihood to understand your message, support your message, and support the policies you go for. So this is a potential kind of message. For America to reach its full potential as the economic and moral leader in the world, the nation must intentionally unlock the potential of our children, ensuring that all kids have opportunities to grow, develop, and thrive. And I would add a second sentence there that really points out how we are failing to do that for children of color. I don't mean to suggest you shouldn't talk about race, but that first sentence is just to appeal to the value and put race at just the tiniest bit lower in the communication. Second example, give you a moment to read the blue side while I take a breath. This blue side is making the case that we should manage and address these issues because there are a lot of children in immigrant families and children of color. And while that is true, it is easily misinterpreted as through the dominant understanding of, oh my goodness, we're being overrun. That there are so many of these other people that is now our obligation to kind of take care of. It's just opening the door to an unproductive conversation that you don't need to open the door for. So again, the data are important, but think about how the data might be misinterpreted by people with different different understandings of the issue than what you have. And so a similar way to make the same sort of argument is here on the right. We need all children here to reach their full potential if we are to reach ours as a nation. Much of the country's future success depends on whether we will equip children living in immigrant families and their parents with the tools and skills to learn, develop, and contribute. We can't afford to wait any longer to figure out how to get this right. 1 in 4 children in the United States lives in a family where at least one parent was born abroad. And I think that phrasing of at times when you have the space about in a family where at least one parent was born abroad, it kind of just says, families have mixed statuses, right? These are not necessarily lots of people from somewhere else. These are people who have been incorporated into our society already in our very homes, and so it's really just giving a sense of immigrants as us, as opposed to immigrants as them. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a moment before I move on to the second recommendation and just take a moment and see, check in on the questions. Is that okay, Flo? Do you have a couple queued up?
At the moment, there aren't any questions. If you have any, please go ahead and submit them.
Okay, great. Then I will keep rolling. Recommendation number 2 is to attend carefully to the attribution of responsibility when highlighting racial or ethnic disparities. And I'll define that phrase, attribution of responsibility, in just the next slide. The attribution of responsibility refers to the framing of who or what causes the problem, who or what is affected, and where responsibility for addressing it lies. And you have to be a little bit like this savvy detective there that I've added, because to really look through carefully the aspects of your communication that work together to create the attribution of responsibility. It can be the pronouns. It can be the sentence structure. And I'll give you a couple examples of how to think about shifting your attribution of responsibility to really show what is affecting these communities. So here's a pretty typical description of data you might have in your report. The proficiency rate data revealed that more than half of fourth graders nationally are struggling to learn to read. And on the other side, we do something else. So instead of the students struggling and failing, and the responsibility, the consequences for that just go to the fourth graders, right? They're failing to reach an important milestone. There's nobody filled in on this blue side that says why that happens, who creates this problem. Because it's not filled in, because you haven't framed that for people, they're coming with their pre-frame, which is whoever's failing is that they're not trying hard enough. So how can we shift the attribution of responsibility to really make this a social problem with a structural fix? Here's a simple example. So given that more than half of fourth graders nationally are not reading at the levels needed to prepare the nation for an information-based economy, the proficiency rate data suggests that greater efforts are needed to strengthen the education system. So who does this affect? Now it affects all of us. The nation needs this. There is a hint of who's responsible for the cause. It's the strength or weakness of the education system. And this little phrase that given that more than half of them, it gives you at least more of a hint that it can't be that so many people are lazy or not doing their homework or whatever it may be, but rather that this is a really a broad problem. And on its own, that wouldn't be enough, but that little phrase there with these other things really makes this more of a us, not them problem. Another example. Instead of saying that families of color are facing the longest odds for succeeding, and we would want to shift this to saying that they're forming an assessment of how well we're preparing children to take on the opportunities and challenges that we'll encounter tomorrow. So again, it's not just a problem for Black communities, Native American communities, or Hispanic communities. It is a problem for our communities tomorrow. So this isn't a quick kind of or simple strategy where I could just give you a checklist, but I do want to ask you to pay attention to it, rephrase relentlessly, really look at what you're saying about who's responsible for the disparities. Are you pointing to some sort of underlying cause? Are you pointing to a shared consequence? Just the idea is not leaving room for the public imagination to fill in blame for those disparities on the marginalized communities themselves. And the final recommendation is to use a science-informed brain development frame to explain universal processes of human development, and then show how development is being undermined by inequitable or exclusionary policies. So that's a mouthful. What I mean by this is that as you're talking about the processes that are affecting children, focus on the universal human process. And we recommend that you use that, talk about the brain and brain development rather than just development by itself, and I can say more about why in a moment. But all children develop, all children are developing brains. But some of those children are subject to or are surrounded by conditions that are undermining and disrupting that universal, that universal need and process. So moving from a brain frame, from a group frame to a brain frame does a couple things. It brings in a sense of scientific authority. It brings in, and by appealing to a more scientific kind of argument, it leaves you less vulnerable to being dismissed as a, idealistic, just care about the kids do-gooder, but rather is has a different source of kind of evidence and power behind it. So here's an example of how that might look. Instead of talking, let's say you're talking about deportation. No child should have to live in fear of being separated from their parents. This is not the most powerful framing because it's very vulnerable to being dismissed. So first of all, it's an opinion, right? No child should. So right away, you've kind of framed yourself as, if not a political partisan, an issue partisan, right? You've got a definite point of view. You've appealed to the idea of fear, but you haven't given kind of any reason why that's a bad thing. And without, kind of adding some power to this somehow, I can see an American reacting to this by saying, well, sure, in an ideal world, maybe children shouldn't have to live in fear, but if their parents came here illegally, that's part of the risk they took. I'm kind of just dismissing that these kids don't have kind of the right to that. With this alternative, you take away some of those counter arguments. So highly stressful experiences can disrupt the building of children's brain architecture, and few childhood experiences are more stressful than a long-term or permanent separation from a parent. So this tone is more scientific. It's a statement of fact, therefore somewhat less vulnerable to rebuttal. But you've also, by appealing to this idea of brain development, you've set up both urgency and the long term. So there's not this sense of, one day they were scared, but rather it's added a sense of gravity because brains are developing right now and it has long-term consequences. I've seen a couple questions that are about, this stuff seems a little longer. And I am saying yes. Yes, it is. You have observed correctly, and that is a feature, not a bug. I could have gotten away on this green side of the screen with just saying few childhood experiences are more stressful than separation from a parent. But I'm recommending taking the extra words because with that first part of the phrase there, you've built in a concept, this idea of stress disrupting brains, that can be really helpful to you in other issues. As we know, we have different pushes on policy issues at different times. There are different breaking issues. Issues evolve, and so in 1 year we're advocating for Head Start. A decade later, we're advocating for universal pre-K. Then after that, we're advocating for paid leave. We also need to think about child abuse and neglect. And so can we, through these related issues, but with some similar science underneath them, take the opportunity of each and every one to build in concepts that benefit us for the next issue, the next push? If we can take an explanatory approach and consistently teach some of these principles of development, we can, over time, shift the baseline of public understanding to our advantage. A quick example of what that looks like, of highlighting these underlying principles, there's one way to kind of apply brain architecture to 3 different issues. When early learning settings are high quality, they actively build early brain architecture. If you're talking about SNAP or school lunch programs, right? The brain is rich, those sorts of things. Brain is being built in the early stages of life. Sound nutrition is an essential construction material. And then you need to get to paid leave. We need that consistent, stable, responsive caregiving to build brain architecture. If we had paid parental leave, that would help ensure strong foundations. We're building brains. We're not taking on other people's babysitting fees, right? It's a different kind of frame. So all of this is to say we should not try to push public understanding up the hill from scratch each time, like we're not only Sisyphus, but extreme Sisyphus, by thinking about our current topic as an opportunity to teach the underlying principle. We can go further and faster with less frustration. I'm going to pause for the check-in. I can see one here, Flo, which is there a risk of suggesting that some kids have broken brains? Good question, and certainly a question to consider when you are applying these kinds of frames to children of color. We know that deficit thinking is easy to creep in. I would say that is a reaction that we haven't seen very often in the 10-plus years that we've been recommending this core story of early childhood development. But it is a possibility. Some things you can do to prevent that kind of reaction is to, always talk about how the construction project starts early but goes on for a long time. Never give a suggestion that it's the first 1,000 days and you're done developing. But rather this is an ongoing process, begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and there are lots of factors that influence it, right? So you want to kind of build in the idea of brain plasticity to avoid the idea that damage done is damage done. There's more I could say there, but I was supposed to be done by 2:35, so I want to respect Tara's time because she has some great ideas to share. So definitely we've got time at the end, I believe, for more conversation, and our virtual door is always open to Kids Counters. You can email me there and continue the conversation on Twitter or by connecting with us on LinkedIn or our website. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Julie. This is Tara Manthey, and I'm the Communications and Outreach Director at the Colorado Children's Campaign. And I've worked with frameworks for many years and appreciate all of that advice, and there's always something new to explore and learn from them as we continue figuring out how to talk about kids. And I agree, it is definitely not something that you can find the magic tweet that will change people's minds. It's taken many, many years to get into the confusion that we have about child development and public policy, and it will take us all speaking together over many tens of thousands of tweets if necessary to move that needle. At the Children's Campaign, like many of you, our Kids Count data book has been focused on child well-being for many years, and in particular on disparities by race and ethnicity. This year we took a different approach to that, not only presenting the disparities of children in Colorado's outcomes by race and ethnicity, but really trying to get at the root of why those disparities exist, and as much as possible using the voices of Coloradans most impacted and allowing them to tell those stories. And so this year we worked with the Center for Social Inclusion and a local group called Omni Institute to host a series of focus groups around the state in communities of color, including American Indian communities, Latino, Black communities, refugee groups, and rural and urban areas, and took the data that we had and went to those groups and had really deep and interesting discussions about what got us to these outcomes. And we have incorporated all of those results and discussion into our Kids Count data book. And at the end of my presentation, I'll add some links into the comments so you can access those. And I'm not going to give you the presentation, but I am going to talk a little bit about what's underlying some of the things we did from a communications perspective. And then I'm also going to give you a link at the end to a full a YouTube video of a full presentation so you can see our brilliant research director, Sarah Hughes, present this full report. So one of the big important things to know about our report is we really shifted from us knowing it all to us not knowing it all. And while we're still a respected voice about kids and their well-being, we really wanted to take the voices in communities and make those, weave those in throughout the report. So here's a really poignant quote from one of our focus group participants that says, "Our lives are impacted both personally and communally by both things that happen to us as individuals and then also as a people." And there were many, many things that rose up in these discussions, and we were looking for those things that helped us tell a structural story, and also tell those stories of values that Julie mentioned. So not only helping, we don't just tell people about the values, we're showing those values with these voices. And then we're also telling that story of attribution, really explaining the structures that are behind the outcomes that we've seen through this report. So one of those areas, and I'm not going to go into the details here, so if this piques your interest, dig into our report to read about it. But one of the areas we really wanted to share, to explore, were the economic situations underlying a lot of the outcomes we see by race and ethnicity in Colorado. And again, this is we're 4 slides into this presentation and I still haven't given you any data. And that is on purpose, and that is because we wanted these voices and the values to come across as much as possible. So in this presentation, we're giving a really complex background on why there is such significant racial segregation in our communities and why that history of explicit racism in our housing practices contributes to our outcomes we see in our children today. So here's a quote from one of our participants in Denver who talks about the practice of redlining and his family not being able to access homes in the neighborhoods that they wanted to raise their children in. Here's a map of redlining to show people this is an actual thing that happened, and it's not just where people choose to live. And again, another quote that shows that every generation starts over. There are structures that are at play here that people have no control over, no matter how hard individuals work or how aspirational they are. So then we really dive into the numbers, and like many of you, we spent many years talking about our poverty rate and telling people it's outrageous that there's this many kids in Colorado and in the U.S. that are living in poverty. We also started telling that story of the disparities by race and ethnicity and saying, isn't it even more outrageous that our kids of color are more likely to be living in poverty? But if you'll note at the top here, we're really trying to shift, and I'm using the fancy highlighter, but not very effectively. We're trying to shift our frame to talking about this isn't the fault of these children. This is based on these discrimination in housing and employment that we have resulted in higher poverty rates for children of color. So even in a slide where you have the raw data and you can't provide a lot of context, you can use headlines and titles and subtitles to really point to that attribution, as Julie mentioned. And then finally, here's another one where we really start getting into busting myths people have about why children of color are more likely to live in poverty. And this is a complex chart, and we don't present too many of these because we want to make the point to people so that they really understand that and want to dig into the data more. But really showing that children, no matter their income, children of color are much more likely to live in concentrated poverty than children in of other races. So again, those are just a few examples, and I'm going to give you a few more and talk a little bit more about why we're doing what we're doing here. Again, another topic, health insurance. So we definitely attribute the steep drop in uninsured children in Colorado to the many state policy changes, federal reforms, bipartisan efforts, coordinated community projects, et cetera, to that. It shows that this is a policy created uninsured children, and policy can uncreate uninsured children. Telling that story of success and attributing where that is driven from. And still saying, despite that progress, there's work to do. We know that what works, and we know that we've worked really hard to cover all kids, and there are still kids who face more barriers than others, and we know what to do to remove those barriers, and it's something that we can win. So then again, when we talk about disaggregating race in uninsured children, we're going to look at the drops among Black children. That is not accidental, that is purposeful, and policy was created to make sure communities were able to access health insurance. And we also know that among our Hispanic and Latino children, they're much more likely to be uninsured than other groups because of continued barriers that we have not addressed, such as language, such as families without documentation. And if you're, I'll come back to that point about Latino children in a minute, but wanted to note that on this chart, the American Indian bars is really striking, and in our report we go into some depth about that. Many American Indian children are insured under the Indian Health Service, but by standards that the rest of us live by, they're considered uninsured because that service is so poor. Okay, so again, we wanted to bring in those voices. So when we talk about these numbers, we also buttress that with these testimonials. This woman said, "My youngest child is the only one who has health insurance because she's the only one with papers. My other children don't have access to services." So again, as we all know who we've listened to Frameworks webinars, we're not trying to shift to the perspective of the individual who is and distracts you from the work of undoing structures and systems. But we do want to make sure that people are hearing those values and understanding the structures in human terms. Another example that we give is infant mortality. So I'm going to quickly go through this, and you can see, again, we're just digging deeper. We're telling you, here is the data by race and ethnicity, and then again, here's the data by income, and showing how the only one of the underlying factors is race in all of this, even when you control for income, and that there are reasons, policy and structural reasons for this. So again, there are many examples in our data book to give you examples about this, and I've shortened this presentation so you don't have to see all those. But one thing we do also in this book and in our presentations about it is really push people to think about, is this the kind of Colorado we want for our kids? Is it okay that we have such disparities among our kids of color? And really push people to think about those values that we share and move beyond kind of partisanship and blaming and that kind of thing. So, and some advice we give to our networks and really driving the work that we've done is not only collecting your data, race data by race and ethnicity, but disaggregating it where possible. And then when you see disparities, ask why, and ask your communities and partners why, and get those answers as part of your data. And we've really shifted from not only just valuing qualitative data, census data, state Department of Health data, but also looking at that qualitative data, the information from communities most impacted, and presenting that as valid and important part of the discussion. Whenever you have policies that you're looking at, use an equity lens to examine not only why there are disparities, but asking what are the structures under there, asking why 5 times, and there are many tools on the Advocacy Learning Lab to help with that. And then again, as we attempted to do in this, make sure the communities who are most impacted by the issue, especially in including communities of color at the table for discussions from the outset. So if you're having trouble explaining these things, if you get your Race for Results report and really are at a loss for how to frame this, how to talk about it, go to communities that are impacted and represented in those data and ask for their help in telling that story. A few more resources to dive into to help explain those structural stories. And I'm going to add those links that I promised in the chat real quick. And Adam has a question about qualitative data. It's great that you convene focus groups. How did you do this? Did you turn it into an in-house or hire a firm to recruit participants? Was there anything unexpected that you discovered in the process? Yes, we wrote a grant to a local funder that is focused on health equity to support that work. That was not our normal process for developing our data book for the past 20 plus years. And it was a pretty significant project, but we knew from our work with the CSI and with the foundation that we really needed to shift the lens we were using, and that by not addressing by not explaining some of the structural barriers behind the outcomes that we see, we were not only not changing that narrative, but we were furthering narratives that put the blame on those communities. So we won't be able to replicate that every year, but we are working really hard on trying to figure out how to incorporate that process or those voices in future editions. Anything unexpected that we discovered in the process was, facilitation really matters. So we had support from a local organization, Omni Institute, that does focus groups and that kind of thing, and we had the Center for Social Inclusion create our facilitation guides and some exercises to help people begin thinking about data in the systemic way and not on an individual level. One of those focus groups in a very rural and white community, we could not get out of that thinking. There was just continued to be blaming communities of color for having those outcomes. So in that case, we didn't have as strong a facilitation as we had in other groups. And so it really, it was a big awakening for us. And so we wrote up those learnings, and we're producing a toolkit for local discussions about race and ethnicity, or data around race and ethnicity. And I will share that with you all when we have that done. It's almost complete. So Leslie says, at this stage in the process, what would you suggest as a starting point for ways to engage with impacted communities ahead of the release of the report and to ensure they're at the table and to maintain those relationships afterwards? That's a great example, or great question. If you have an organization in your community, for example, there's a group in Denver called Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, and they work in schools to give Latino parents access to resources to become better advocates, and then they also fight for policy change at the school board and state level. We began working with them years ago after being loosely affiliated with them, we had mutual interests. But a few years ago, the Children's Campaign internally, we sat down and said, who are the partners that we are not strongly serving, and how can we become better partners? They become kind of one of those partners that we all know we have that we could call on any time, and our CEOs know each other, and our communications people know each other. And we set out, and there's probably not time for this now, but we set out quite a big list of ways we could be better partners, and said to them, what do you need from us, without expecting anything in return. And so we sponsored a table at their gala. We support their communications, wherever we could help build their capacity without any exchange, we did. And we can't do that for every organization in town. We do it with groups that we're aligned with closely. And so look for that group now and say, here's an opportunity that we have to tell a story about your community, and just be really humble and say, we are not the experts, and we know you are, and we would love to partner with you to help tell the story, and we really want to defer to you on being the voice for that, or working together, however it best suits your organization. And then making sure that you check back in with them after it's over and say, how did that feel for you? Did that seem like, was that helpful? Did that put a lot of stress on your organization? When these kinds of things come up in the future, how can we make that not as much of an issue? Okay, toolkit, and I'm going to...
Tara, there's another question. Were you going to say something? Sorry.
No, go ahead. Is it Whitney's? What sort of messaging did they use to reach out to affected community members? Is this for the, Whitney, is this for the, to get the buy-in? So, this was the organizations that work with affected communities. We loosely knew about them. I think the message was just humility and saying we both have the same goal, and we understand we work in a completely different world than you and operate differently, and we want to learn from you and help support you, because we know we can't achieve this mission alone. And it just takes a lot of humility, and for the Children's Campaign, that was a big shift from moving from trying to be the most important voice for kids, and we're the ones who know best, and we're at the Capitol fighting for everyone, to us shifting to a completely different perspective, and understanding that communities know best what is best for their people. And that has really shifted our policy focus in many ways. Our policy development is completely different. So we can talk in another webinar about outreach and engagement. We have several great groups in the network who've done a lot of work in that area. Get back to you, Flo.
Well, maybe I'll pop in here. Of course, we've got a couple more minutes if people have questions or comments or want to share their experiences. But I also want to make sure that we've got some time to right this second, we're not going to send you an email afterwards asking for a survey. We would like you to right now click the link that I just put in the chat box, or you can also type it in. It's there on the screen, and fill out just a few easy questions. I want to let you know that Frameworks will be creating a resource for the Kids Count Network to assist with something stable that can be used, over the years, to really put some of these ideas and more into writing. So there's a stable resource available. So your feedback will absolutely shape that. The survey won't just go into a vacuum or hole of data. We will use it. So please fill it out. Other than that, I'll turn it back over to Flo to say our warm goodbyes and appreciation.
Great, thank you. So thanks, Julie, and thanks, Tara, for sharing the wonderful resources that you mentioned in the webinar. As was mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. We'll be posting a link to the webinar as well as links to resources that Tara and Julie share on Kidsnet, and those resources will also be on all. Just wanted to thank you all for participating in the webinar. If there's anything that you need assistance with, please feel free to reach out to anyone who's on the call today or to anyone here at the station. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes?
May I ask who's
Hello?
speaking?
Yes, my name is Barbara Honig. Is this the webinar on poverty data?
No. On what data?
Poverty.
No.
Oh, she gave me the wrong number.
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. You have been conducting a meeting for a long period of time. If you need to continue meeting, press 1 now. If not, I'll end the meeting.